Hello, ladies and gentlemen, gabestah here. This is it. It's the guide for heroic Lei Shen. And as usual, this is the full guide. So if you just want the quick guide with a lot less information and the basics, click on the annotation there. So before I begin, I just want to briefly mention that in terms of overall difficulty, in my opinion, Lei Shen is actually easier than heroic Dark Animus. At least in our experience, the Lei Shen fight took about 115 attempts to get our first kill, and Dark Animus was about 200. So obviously that doesn't prove anything, but based on the descriptions of Raiden, which we're about to face pretty soon, my assumption is that for us anyway, Dark Animus will be the most difficult boss of this tier. So take that as you will. That said, Lei Shen is very challenging, and there's a lot of stuff going on, especially in the intermission and final phases. So most of it is about timing, getting your the sense of exactly what can occur at what moment down, and then kind of getting used to that pattern. So let's get started. For your raid composition, it's pretty standard fare here. You'll want 2 tanks and 2 to 3 healers. And the healer count, in my opinion, 2 is the way to go. The amount of healing required in the first phase, as well as intermission phases, is quite low. And the only phase where there's a lot of healing to be done is the final phase. But with the DPS that should be available to raids these days, I think it's better to focus on damage rather than healing in that case. Having said that, the non-standard things that can really help in terms of raid composition are sort of the gimmick type abilities that you can add on to your raid just based on class or spec. So here you can see 3 of them that are very strong. The first and most important is the number of immunity or high damage reduction, like 90% plus reductions that are available to your raid members. This is primarily to allow players to soak static shock by themselves, which is essentially vital to your intermission phase methods. The second thing that's really useful is Death Knight that can use the AE Death Grip ability. I don't know the exact name of it. I assume it's AE Death Grip anyway. And have them pull in all the ball lightning spawns when they appear, and then they can be AE stunned. This will allow you to pretty much trivialize that portion of the fight, which is otherwise very dangerous. And then lastly is a warlock, or multiple warlocks if you're lucky, that can use teleports to allow the raid to move from a thunderstruck position into a safe position very easily. This is mostly important on the final phase when there's a lot of damage and movement issues going on. So, if you can alter your composition at all to get any one of those things, it's going to really help you a lot in the long run. You know, not to make someone sit because of it or anything, but those are very vital. All right, let's move on. So, the changes on heroic are pretty significant. The biggest change by far is that when a conduit becomes overloaded, and therefore you disable it from that point forward, that ability for that conduit continues throughout the rest of the fight. So unlike normal where you sort of disable them based on which you want to get rid of because it's the most dangerous, it's the opposite on heroic. You actually do the order of conduit overcharging or overloading based on the abilities that you think you can most easily deal with throughout the remainder of the fight. Now, there are multiple strategies to this fight. Obviously, you can choose any 2 that you want, in theory. But I'm only going to focus on one strategy for this, and that's the method that we use here. And I'll talk about why in the strategy section for that. But for now, just assume that you're doing the same overloading that we are here. The only other major addition on heroic is the new ability Helm of Command. You can see it being cast on me right there. This occurs during the intermission phases and is cast on a random raid member. And it basically pushes the player back while dealing very heavy damage to them over the duration. This essentially requires some form of movement boost, as well as either healing or damage reductions to survive the damage as well. This is used basically twice on the intermission phase. So again, here you can see it on me, and I use my short duration sprint and then my torpedo to sort of keep me in the same relative position without getting pushed off the edge. And then here's a clip of, it looks like our warrior who gets it. So I give him my sprint, and he also has his leap and safeguard abilities to move around if needed, or intervene rather. So we'll talk more about this in the intermission section, but this is really the only other major addition on Heroic. So as mentioned before, the order that you overload the pillars is very important and will determine which abilities you have to deal with for the remainder of the encounter. For this strategy, we start with the north pillar, which is static shock, and we overload this one, so meaning we take him up to 90 plus energy and then pull him out. And then we go clockwise from there, so east next for diffusion chain, then south for overcharge, and then finally west for bouncing bolt before we transition and end the phase. Now you shouldn't have any trouble pushing the DPS enough to transition Lei Shen into the intermission at 66 prior to any of the pillars leveling up. So if you do 90 plus on your first pillar, whichever one you overload, then you should be able to do the rest below 80 or so before it becomes an issue. And if you don't level them up here, then that's exactly what you want. So you can level up some of them in the next phase. So let's go through the timings and positions for phase 1. You can see them listed at the bottom there. Sorry for the small text, but there's a lot to go through here. The transition timings are really all that matters. So the first thing is your ranged should be stacked up. As you can see, we're going clockwise, so the far position is max range, the opposite direction that you're moving between pillars. So in this case, it's to the left. You can see the range on the left of the screen there, and they're stacked up there for Thunderstruck. So once it moves, they move to the other side, which would be the far position for the next quadrant that we're in. Now the timing to move to the next pillar is right after decapitate on tank A, tank B taunts and moves to the next pillar, which is around 90 energy the taunt occurs, so that the boss will have 94 to 98 energy when he gets over here. And that's the first pillar that you want to be the highest energy, of course. Once you get over here, range should spread out right away so that the special move for the pillar that's used immediately, which is diffusion chain, only hits one player and spawns one ad. After that, they can stack up on the normal far location for Thunderstruck. There you see it again. And kill the ad as usual. The tank A will taunt out shortly after Thunderstruck, around 75 energy or so, and pull the boss to the third pillar. Now, as the boss is being taunted over, all the raid members should stack up in the melee position close to the boss. So we have a yellow marker there to designate where that is. And this is so the overcharge effect, which goes out almost right away when you get here, is going to hit somebody that's stacked up with the raid and therefore not be in danger. Now your tank A that got decapitate right after this may need a stun break or some form of cooldown because they'll probably get hit by the overcharge stun. And then tank A will taunt after Thunderstruck hits to move to the final platform. You have to taunt immediately. And there's going to be a lot of stacks of the discharge energy as you transition from the third to the final pillar. So a couple raid cooldowns are probably useful to mitigate some of that damage. But if the tank just taunts from range, that will speed up the process a lot, so you'll get a lot fewer ticks. And then you just deal with the bouncing bolts, and then you should transition into 66% and push the boss right after that. So that's the basic process and positioning for phase 1, and it's almost completely repeatable every time. There are some gimmicks or quirks, I should say, where the boss will slightly change his timing, but you just have to kind of roll with those punches and for the most part, exactly what you see there will work every time. All right, the next thing to discuss is the intermission abilities and the target selection that they have. This will help you determine the assignments that you put players at for intermission phases. So, bottom left, you can see the list of the abilities. Overcharge can target any non-tank player. It will target 2 players at level 1, which it should be throughout the fight. And it will split among platforms if possible. So as long as you have valid targets on each of the platforms, you will only get 2 casts of it in the first phase and 3, 1 on each platform in the second phase. Static Shock can target any non-tank, once again. It has 2 targets at level 1, and again split among platforms. So this will be the highest level that Static Shock's pillar ever reaches, since it was the first that you overloaded at the start. Therefore, in both intermission phases, you'll still only get 2 Static Shocks, 1 per platform, as long as you have people at multiple platforms available. Finally, or not finally, but next we have Diffusion Chain, and this can target any ranged DPS or non-monk healer. This will target 1 player at all levels. So throughout the fight, when Diffusion Chain is cast, you can expect it to only hit 1 person. The key, of course, is to spread out, and the ad that it spawns will increase in difficulty based on the level rather than number of spawns. Next is Helm of Command, which of course is the new ability. There you can see it on our warrior again. And this will target 1 player at a time, but anybody is a valid target, including tanks. And then finally, Bouncing Bolt. Obviously this doesn't target players, but it will target all platforms, 1 or 2 balls per platform at level 1, which will be the highest level you will go to. So with those target selections in mind, possibilities, now we can design the actual setup for the raid and how they stand in position for the platforms, or for the intermissions. So now that we know which abilities can be used on which players, we can assign everyone to a quadrant for intermission. So here you can see a couple things. On the right, of course, is my very lovely diagram that I made when we were setting up for this fight. So as you might guess, the north quadrant is the north quadrant in the game, so the top one, and that's Static Shock. You can see the blue circle indicates the blue raid marker, which is just like you see in the video, and green and purple and red going clockwise from there. The numbers in black text and the actual writing there indicate the positions for players for the first and second intermissions respectively. So line number 1 is the positions in those quadrants for the first intermission, and number 2, of course, is the second. And then finally, the red markers are just the order that we're doing the pillars in the normal phases between intermissions. So in the bottom left, you can see the basic goals that were put into setting up these assignments. And you can use these overall goals to set up your own assignments, since obviously your raid makeup will be slightly different than mine. So first, the idea is to allow Static Shock solo soak players to pair with a tank on platforms when possible. So in our raid makeup, the best 2 players for that, which were non-healer players, that's important, were our Shadow Priest and our Rogue. So again, you can see in the north position we have Tank A, who is our Monk tank, with our Shadow Priest, and they duo that platform. Then to the east, Tank B is our Paladin tank, plus our Rogue. They handle the other platform. This is because if Static Shock gets on the Shadow Priest or the Rogue, they can each solo it with 1 cooldown. And then if they get a second Static Shock, since the tank is not a valid target, then they get an outside cooldown and stack up with the tank for that second one. And then on the bottom, the purple or south, which is where I'm located, is our Monk healer, me, plus 2 melee, or in the case of this video, we didn't have 2 melees, so it was 1 melee and 1 ranged DPS that was again capable of solo soaking, which is not necessary, but that was the idea. And then finally, our other healer and ranged on the west platform to the left. So the second rule is to allow an outside cooldown for duo pairs if a non-tank gets 2 times static shock. Mentioned that already. Third is force most or all ranged targets onto one platform, which forces diffusion chain adds to spawn there. So you're not always able to do this depending on your raid makeup, especially if you don't have very much melee. But in the second intermission, when you have one fewer quadrants to deal with, this becomes easier to do. But generally speaking, the more ranged you have in one quadrant, the more likely it is that diffusion chain will target someone in that quadrant, since ranged are the only valid targets for diffusion chain, and then you'll get the add there. And this is just a way to focus that add where you want it and make sure it dies quickly. And then finally is to stack melee with the lower mitigation abilities for static shock with your monk healer if you have one, or just basically with your position that is less populated. So in the first intermission, it doesn't matter because we're split up 3, 3, 2, and 2. But in the second intermission, the west platform has 4 players. So in this case, you want the weaker static shock soakers to be on the platform without the tanks, not the non-tank positions. But then they can be with the healers. So we have our weaker melee soakers south with me as a healer, so that we don't have to deal with the fusion chain, but we can soak up static shocks with slightly fewer targets than the west one with 4 targets. Anyway, so those are the basic rules of assignment. There are a few alternative methods to this, and I'll briefly mention them. We tried a few of them. One thing that's very common for people to suggest is to have your monk tank solo one of the quadrants. But we found that it wasn't worth the effort. Basically, all it saves is the potential for one diffusion chain spawn to appear on that platform if you're using a ranged over there instead of a melee. And the downside is that monk will generally get adds from the bouncing bolts because it's very difficult for them to soak 2 bouncing balls as one player. Now, technically, they can tank them on their own, but it just seemed more stable for us if we put a semi-healer over there. So we allowed our Shadow Priest to go over there, and if they get an add, he can actually do some healing in between the damaging effects. So that helps quite a bit. So let's talk about intermission timings and tactics. That is, how you individually or with your small group handle your quadrant during intermission. And I know I've been talking about intermission stuff a lot, but it's really the key to this entire encounter. This will be the part where you're spending most of your time and practice. So the first thing to note is that most of the abilities on intermission kind of come in pairs. And the sooner you get used to that pattern, the better. The first pair is always overcharge and diffusion chain. So those will happen around the same time. And then the second pair is Helm of Command and Bouncing Bolt. Static Shock is sort of the in-between filler ability that will happen between those. But for the most part, you can basically plan on one of those pairs happening around one time or another and act accordingly. So I'm just going to keep looping through the 2 intermission phases that we go through and just walk through kind of what I'm doing here, or what our group's doing. So the first and best tip I can offer is that if your platform has any ranged or non-monk healer in it, then you're valid for diffusion chain, and you need to make sure you're spread out enough for when that spawns. So the best step you can take that we found is to position around the marker circle that's in the middle of the platform there. So that blue and golden circle that I'm standing next to. Here you can see I'm on sort of the bottom right of it, our hunter's in the top middle, and our warrior's on the bottom left. And that way, if we get diffusion chain, which of course our hunter is the only valid target in our group, we won't be close enough together to spawn multiple adds. So any quadrant that has a ranged valid target for diffusion chain should immediately set up a position around that center ring that everyone can always go to at every time. So I always go to this right side, our warrior always goes to the left, and our hunter always goes to the top. And our ranged group on the west has a similar setup. So just get something going quickly, figure out positions for those players and then just have them repeat it, because repetition is the key to getting used to this fight. And the sooner you do that, the better. So once Diffusion Chain is cast, you should have some form of alert or just pay really close attention, because shortly following that, you'll need to stack for overcharge. The timing is not very forgiving, so that's why you have to stay somewhat close. Using that circle as your positions means that you're always within 5 or 10 yards of someone that gets overcharge, and you can step into the safe overcharge location right away. So again, I'll just loop through it here. You can see here we're positioning around the circle, and we wait for Diffusion Chain to be cast. And I have a little weak which I'll link in the description there, that says safe stack, that green bar. That just is a warning that Diffusion Chain was just cast, so we're safe to get in and stack for overcharge. So then we all stack up for overcharge, and we're good. So the second pair of abilities, again, are the Bouncing Bolt and the Helm of Command. So the best thing for dealing with these is once overcharge explodes, move your camera angle or zoom out if you need to so you can see bouncing bolts quickly, and then have general quadrant assignments or side assignments within your group to designate which players will handle bouncing bolts on which parts of the platform. So again, I would use the circle assignments or left and right or front and back, that kind of thing. But for our platform, I generally always get the ones on the right or to the front, and then our warrior will always get the ones on the left or to the back, and then our hunter is our substitute. So that if one of the players gets Helm of Command, the other one, the sub player, can get the bouncing bolt. So there you see I'm getting the front one, and our warrior gets the one on the left, kind of to the back. So again, figure out something that you can just repeat, and always know that this player on this quadrant is always going to get the bolts on this area or this side, and it will become much easier once you start repeating that a few times. Here you see something that doesn't happen often, but there's two bolts here. So be very careful there, because that can one-shot a player without a cooldown if you're not careful. So I just used a cooldown to make sure. And then finally, or not finally actually, then Helm of Command around the time of bouncing bolts. If you get that, then you have to use a movement boost ability of some kind, as well as a damage reduction if you don't have a healer on your platform. You don't necessarily need a direct healer, a full-time healer, just someone capable of throwing some heals on you, because it does enough damage that it will kill a non-tank player over the course of its duration. And if the Helm of Command pushes the player through the puddles on the ground left from the first phase, then those can be quite a bit of damage. So you'll definitely need a cooldown or strong healing for that. So there you see our warrior getting hit by the Helm. And so the hunter and I split up the bolts, and our warrior uses his movement stuff while I heal him. And that's pretty much it. Then finally is Static Shock. So again, this is mostly related to your assignments in terms of which players you put where. But for the most part, if you are on a more populated platform, you can simply stack up for Static Shock. If you are on a lesser populated platform, like a duo platform or even a trio platform, and you're capable of soloing it, which you should be if you're there, then you should use a solo ability that allows you to soak the Static Shock by yourself. And then if you get a subsequent one, then you have to use cooldowns for it. So again, our rogue or shadow priest, they would use a solo ability. For me or the hunter on our platform, if we get it, we both can solo it. Our warrior cannot solo it, so if he gets it, the three of us stack up, and I use a minor cooldown because I tend to take a lot of damage from them. But otherwise, yeah, that's pretty much the idea. So if you can solo Static Shock during intermission, you should basically do it always. If you can't, then make sure you handle the other abilities before you handle Static Shock, because generally there'll be something else that just happened or is about to happen, like bouncing bolts is often one of the things. And that's it, really. So once you get, you just kind of get that pattern down to those 5 abilities. This applies to both the intermission phases. The only difference is that on the second intermission phase, you get more overcharged. So basically every platform always gets overcharged, whereas in the first intermission, only 2 out of the 4 get it. But otherwise, everything is the same in terms of timing, number of spawns and whatnot. You should also know that overcharged on intermission number 2 is really damaging, probably a one-shot mechanic for just about everybody. Whereas the first phase, it's not necessarily a one-shot ability. All right, that's a lot of stuff, but let's move on. So before we get into the timings of phase 2, I want to briefly talk about ball lightning. This is one of those mechanics that will become very dangerous and difficult depending on your raid makeup. Again, I mentioned in the raid composition section, if you have a Death Knight that can do AE Death Grip, the combination of that plus an AE stun from just about anybody will almost trivialize the ball lightnings that otherwise are very dangerous. So as you'll see here, we don't have that available to us, so ball lightnings can be very dangerous during most of the fight. So the basic idea here is that just like in normal, ball lightning will spawn from any player that is outside of melee range of Lei Shen, with a minimum required player count of 3. So what this means is if you have 2 or fewer players that are outside of melee range when ball lightning spawn, you'll get a maximum spawn count, which I believe is 6. But if you have the minimum of 3 players outside of melee range and the other 7 players in melee range, you'll only get 3 spawns. Any players beyond that 3 minimum that are outside of melee range will cause an extra ball lightning to spawn for every player. So the general rule for ball lightning is that when it's about to spawn, if at all possible, try to have only 3 players outside of melee. This, of course, can be tricky if you have a lot of ranged DPS or healers and whatnot. But again, keep that in mind. The idea is to only have 3 players out when ball lightning spawns, if at all possible. So with that, let's talk about the timings for phase 2. Oh, actually I lied. There's one more very important thing about ball lightning. On heroic, when it charges, it does an AE in a small radius around it, which is why it does so much damage on heroic. So anyway, keep that in mind. That's why it's so dangerous. All right, so let's talk about the phase 2 timings and positions. Just like I did for phase 1, I'll pretty much just walk through the step-by-step process of moving from one pillar to the next and handling that quadrant. So before we get into the actual pillar specifics, the general rule for this entire phase for all pillars is that if you are the static shock target during phase 2, you should always move into melee range to spread the static shock damage that way. This will allow you to save your personal solo static shock cooldowns for the intermission, where they actually matter. Whereas in this phase, you can just use extra bodies and soak with other people. All right, so to handle the east pillar for diffusion chain, first, immediately, your ranged DPS and non-monk healers should spread out because diffusion chain will be cast right away. Also, about simultaneously, the first cast of ball lightning will spawn. So, when these spawn, it's a good idea to use 1 or 2 raid cooldowns as well as stuns and whatnot for the ball lightnings, because you cannot mitigate the number of ball lightning spawns in this first set due to that diffusion chain cast. So this ball lightning set will be particularly dangerous and damaging. Following the second chain, diffusion chain cast, all except for 3 ball lightning spawn players should remain in melee range. Those 3 ranged players that are your ball lightning spawners stay outside of melee range when the ball lightning is going to cast, and this will, as mentioned in the ball lightning section, force only 3 ball lightnings to spawn. This can be done again on the second set of ball lightnings following the second diffusion chain, but because of the timing, you can't do it on the first one here. The only exception to this rule is that if one of those assigned ball lightning spawn players gets static shock, you need to have another ranged player ready to substitute out for them as they come in for the melee soaking of static shock. That sub player needs to step out so the ball lightning spawn again will hit the 3 minimum required players. All right, so as we loop back through, the fourth thing really is that tank should try to position Lei Shen very close to the pillar after he levels up the pillar for the first time, and then you're preparing to move him. By keeping him close to the pillar, this will force him to gain force the pillar to gain a few extra ticks of energy, and this makes it easier to ensure that it's the overloaded highest energy pillar at the end of the phase. Finally, with tank B starting the phase, should have threat from this previous phase. Tank A will therefore have threat when the pillar reaches level 2 and Lei Shen uses Fusion Slash following the Lightning Whip, the second round. So there you see it there. So that Fusion Slash is used to knock the player back, tank A, toward the next pillar. And the boss will gain a few extra energy ticks because he was close to the pillar when he started. And then you move into the next quadrant here. So we'll start on that one. So for the second or south overcharge pillar, again, the entire raid should immediately stack up in melee range, here where you see the yellow marker, so that the first overcharge that comes right away is forced onto a safe position, and no one has to be afraid of getting hit. As soon as that goes off, your 3 ball lightning spawners should spread out. And again, remember to substitute one of them if they get static shock and have to move in. And other than that, you just wait for the first lightning whip to go off, which it just did there. And now all of your ranged should stack up again in melee range in preparation for the next overcharge cast. So there's the overcharge, you can see. So everyone's stacking in that. And again, once that goes off, you'll have a static shock that went off around that same time or shortly after. So your ranged should, again, spread out unless one of them gets the assigned static shock, and then substitute that player with one of your assigned ball lightning spawners. And then after that ball lightning is killed, you'll get a whip. And then just like the transition prior, you want to use the Fusion Slash to push the tank across to the next pillar. Now in this case, whereas before you were taking Lei Shen close to the pillar, so he gains a little bit of extra energy, on the second pillar you want to tank him right at the max range of his tether, so that that Fusion Slash that moves him stops him from gaining energy right at that moment. So that's pretty much how you handle the south overcharge. Let's move on to the west and final one for the phase. So the final, or west pillar, is again very simple. So your raid should prepare to soak bouncing bolts as soon as you get over here. That will happen right away. And after that, you'll have ball lightnings pretty quickly. So again, you want your 3 ball lightning spawners to be out, unless there's a static shock substitution. However, one thing to keep note of is, depending on your raid's DPS, you may be approaching the 31% transition period around this time. The problem with that is that it can be very tricky to deal with some of the extra abilities at the same time that you're getting a transition into the intermission. This is in particular because on the second intermission, you have overcharged for all platforms. And if you don't have an overcharged target on all 3 quadrants in that when it casts, then one of the quadrants will get double overcharged. And because overcharged is stronger now, it's leveled up, you're going to get a huge amount of damage and probably just wipe instantly because overcharge will hit somebody. The other thing is you don't want ball lightnings to be active during the phase if you can help it. They're not necessarily something that will kill you, but if you have 2 charges from ball lightning at the same time, it could kill someone that isn't full health, and they're just a nuisance. So for these reasons, we found it was best to play it safe. And basically with our DPS, we would stop at 35% just prior to the transition to the final west quadrant. So stop DPS at 35%. So here you can see he's around that now, and a little lower. And so we're not doing any damage to him. And we wait for the ball lightning spawns to pop up. And once they spawn, then we call for DPS to push Lei Shen. Also, around 32%, just before he transitions, we have our rogue, who is the the overcharge target for the opposite quadrant, meaning the far east one, we have him move out early before the rest of the raid. Because again, if he's not in position for that overcharge, another quadrant will get double spawns. So there you can see him running over there earlier. And that's pretty much it. So just work on that transition, find the right timing for your raid's DPS, and then you can have everyone in their quadrant position around the time that the transition occurs. So the positions for intermission number 2 follow the same basic rules as the first round. So here again are just the same rules and diagram. But if you look at the diagram, again, the second line in black text, mark number 2, shows the rough positions we used for the second intermission. So obviously the north quadrant is overcharged, or overloaded rather, so it's off limits. The east platform, or quadrant, then gets 2 tanks, both of our tanks, plus our rogue. The south one is the same, so me as the monk healer, plus 2 melee, or 1 melee and 1 ranged, depending on your comp. And then the west is the other healer, plus the remaining ranged. So following the basic rules as before, the other changes here are generally to give every platform 3 players, so that static shock soaking always has an out. That is, if necessary, all 3 people can just soak it up. So, for example, the east platform with our rogue, he could just have everyone soak with him if he didn't have his survival cooldown, just like the south platform does if we have to soak together. And then the fusion chain and overcharge are all handled the same. Remember, overcharge will hit very hard on this, so the second intermission, so you cannot get hit at all. It will kill you. And everything else is exactly as it is the first time. Okay, so after you make it through intermission number 2, it's on to phase 3, the final part of the fight, of course. So if you overcharged, or overloaded rather, the north and the east quadrants, and then you'll have the south and west, like we do here, to move about freely. The third phase is really all about ever-increasing raid damage, lots of raid damage, as well as tons of ability cooldowns that you have to keep track of and know your positioning and what you're doing. So it's very chaotic, is the best way to describe it. Now, the abilities you have to deal with, you can see in the bottom left. The first 3, Lightning Whip, Thunderstruck, and Ball Lightning, which are all phase-based abilities, essentially, all have a 30-second cooldown. And they start, the first cast of each of them is listed there, 16, 26, and 32 seconds into the phase, respectively. So each of those has a static 30-second cooldown, and it will always happen that time. The other 2 abilities, Diffusion Chain and Static Shock, are, of course, your overloaded pillar abilities. So these have a 42-second cooldown, and these start at 7 and 19 seconds into the phase, respectively. What this essentially means, though, is, unfortunately, abilities from the first category of 30-second cooldowns don't match up with the 42-second cooldowns of the other overloaded abilities. So eventually, those 2 ability types will overlap. The timing on them will overlap at some point. Now, I'll link in the description a spreadsheet with all the actual timings if you want to see them in detail, but it's just too much information to put on screen here. But the best thing to basically think about is when the timings will be most dangerous or most important. And what we found was that the critical timing was Static Shock number 3 during this phase. The reason that one's the most dangerous is because it goes off, basically it will explode right around the time that Thunderstruck number 4, I believe it is being cast. And if the Static Shock player is trying to get near melee range to stoke Static Shock, that's a potential Thunderstruck that's in the melee and just wipes your raid. So you have to make sure that on that third Static Shock, either the player that gets it solos it with a solo soak cooldown at range, or they stack up with at least 2 other ranged players that can then all move from max range if a Thunderstruck targets them. So third Static Shock was really the big one. Other than that, there's just a lot of general rules to kind of follow or keep in mind. So phase 3 positioning is the key. Everything in this phase really is a positional required ability. So Lightning Whip obviously is a cone attack that will pretty much one-shot you if you get hit. Static Shock requires that you solo it if you can, otherwise you have to stack with people, position to stack. Thunderstruck obviously requires that you spawn it at max range or far away and then get out of range of it before it goes off. Ball Lightning requires that you have their 3 spawners out of range when they're about to spawn if possible. Otherwise you're in melee range. Diffusion Chain requires that you are spread out if you're a ranged and valid target. So yeah, it's just ridiculous the amount of stuff that's going on in terms of positioning and looking at the cooldowns and what's happening next. So to help you with this, the best thing you can really do is have 1 or 2 people that watch your timers like a hawk and just walk through the fight as it's happening. Healers are good for this. I try to do this quite a bit. Our Balanced Druid did this quite a bit, which was helpful. So really just to give everyone a heads up of what's about to happen that may be important to them. Obviously, melee have a lot less to think about than ranged players do, but anyone that is arranged or should be arranged has to think about their position at all times pretty much. The other thing that will help you a lot is considering how you handle Thunderstruck. So it depends a lot on your raid composition. You essentially can use a Warlock portal, if you have one available, to force Thunderstruck to spawn in one area, instantly click the portal, taking you into melee range or slightly beyond it to the other side, and really trivialize the Thunderstruck damage. But if you don't have a Warlock portal available, then you're obviously going to just have to hoof it. But you want to spawn Thunderstruck far away. So the best thing to do is to position your raid, depending on how many ranged and healers you have, on opposite sides of the boss. So what we did is we had 2 groups of 3 players, each on opposite sides of the boss, with the melee kind of in the center off to one side. And that way, when Thunderstruck hits one group of 3, those players are free to move into melee range immediately to avoid the Thunderstruck damage, while the other 3 players that are on the other side stay out of range, so that if Ball Lightning is spawning, which it does shortly after, those Ball Lightning ads will spawn on those players, and not the 3 that just went in for Thunderstruck. So generally speaking, this rule of thumb works really well if you have enough of the right players. Obviously, if you have really heavy melee DPS, not enough ranged or healers, then you'll have to come up with another method. So if you don't have 6 players that you can split up this way, you may have to have a melee prepared to step out to whichever side has fewer than 3 ranged, in case that side was the one with that has to stay out after Thunderstruck. So again, just keep in mind the timing of Ball Lightning, and when that's about to spawn, you need to have your at least 3 players out of melee range. Now you'll see a number of times here in the footage that we have more than 3 players out because there's just so much going on. It's chaotic, but that's the general idea anyway. Other than that, always make sure you're spread due to diffusion chain. Make sure that players that are at range in preparation for Thunderstruck are only as far away from the boss as the closest player on their side. Usually that's going to be the healer, because you have to just basically account for the minimal distance that someone has to be. So if you're 20 yards further back than someone else that's on your side, if that person in front of you gets targeted by Thunderstruck, you're screwed, because you're going to have to run through the Thunderstruck position and then beyond it a little bit more. And by the time you get that far, you're going to take tons of damage from Thunderstruck. So again, just communicate, try to make sure everyone's at 35 or 40 yards if possible, but otherwise just stay at that minimum. Another thing to consider is static shock management. So as I mentioned, the third static shock is the really dangerous one. So if you can save your solo abilities for that, use those to solo that static shock by yourself. But if you cannot do that, and you're a ranged target, you either need to group with at least 2 other ranged players to soak the damage, or you need to come into melee range. But be very careful. If you come into melee range when diffusion chain is happening, that can be bad. So watch the timing for that. And again, this third static shock, you cannot go into melee range because of thunderstruck timing. It just lines up badly. And if you get unlucky and get targeted, you're going to wipe the entire raid. So that's another thing to be careful of. Finally, another minor tip that may help some players is it's often considered bad form for ranged players to be outs anywhere that isn't max range at all times. But the fact of the matter is, as long as you're not in melee range of the boss, you can be very close to the boss anytime that Thunderstruck is not about to occur. So basically every 25 out of 30 seconds approximately, you can be anywhere on the platform that you wish, as long as it's not in melee range of the boss. Because Thunderstruck is the only time you have to actually be at max range or even further. But otherwise, feel free to be closer so that you can spawn ball lightnings closer. Diffusion chain ads might be closer to other people. And most importantly, you'll be closer to heal range of the healer that's probably on the opposite side of you. So that's also another vital thing. Lastly, this isn't really position stuff, but this fight, or this phase, is all about just survival, pretty much. And to that extent, you want to chain your cooldowns anytime there's a Thunderstruck or a Ball Lightning spawn. For Ball Lightning, I wouldn't really use your raid cooldowns unless you get more than 3 spawns. If you get a 5 spawn, for example, like we do a couple times, that's a good time to use cooldowns. Otherwise, Thunderstruck is the best time because for the most part, even at max range, Thunderstruck's going to do a lot of damage to the raid. Similarly, healers need to really focus on topping up the raid just before Thunderstruck hits, or just after, but before is the best, of course. And then utilize your stuns for the ads whenever possible. One thing that's very useful is the Priest's ability to root the diffusion chain ad, pretty much for its entire lifetime or lifespan. So any of those little tips that you can implement will help you a lot on this phase. So with that, I think that really covers everything for Heroic Lei Shen. Because this fight is so complex, I'm going to tack on a walkthrough of just the whole fight all the way through, and I'll talk through it, which I've done in the past a few times. So if you want that sort of thing, stick around for that. Otherwise, I think that covers everything for Heroic Lei Shen. So as always, good luck. Thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoyed this, please subscribe.
Yeah!
Yes.
Fucking nice.
Oh, I'm so glad I decided suicide there.
All right, so here we're just going to go through the walkthrough of the entire fight from my perspective and talk about what we're doing at a given moment and maybe a few tips on what I'm doing in particular as a mistweaver monk. So to that end, actually, for the first phase pretty much entirely, I'm just eminence healing. So just adding a little bit of DPS as I can, and the healing requirement on this first phase is very, very low, so it's not a big deal. I should mention that one thing to be careful of for your melee and tanks are the crashing thunder spawns that will occur. And our DPS warrior noticed interesting behavior that actually allows you to dodge them pretty easily. Basically, they spawn at the location of someone within melee range. So if all your melee spread around the boss somewhere when they're about to spawn, and you get a pillar that spawns on you, you can just move forward into the boss's gut, basically right underneath him, and ensure that you don't get extra pillar damage. The other thing you can do is just watch where he's facing, and that will show you where he's spawning the pillars, roughly. Lastly, if you get the third pillar to spawn on you, then you know that you can back up or sidestep because no other crashing thunder pillars will spawn. So, just a minor tip there. So here you can see moving into the third position, we're stacking up in melee range on our yellow marker so that overcharge is safe. And it only hits our monk tank, who's moving away for decapitate at the time. And once he gets out, he just comes back in. And then our ranged going to the thunderstruck position. And pretty simple. This first phase is obviously the easiest for a lot of reasons, so you'll get used to it quite quickly, I believe, especially if you follow the exact timing pretty much for every transition from one quadrant to the next. So this transition from the third to the fourth is very important because the timing is such that crashing thunder will occur right as the boss is moving across, pretty much. And if you're even remotely close to him in melee range as he's moving across, you can get a crashing thunder. And the combination of that plus the high stacks of discharge energy, since they don't reset on this first phase, means that the damage on that transition is very high. So make sure all of your players, except your tank that's taunting away, are moving kind of on an outside edge going from the third to the fourth quadrant so that they don't get in the crashing thunder. Otherwise, use a raid and or healing cooldowns for that extra damage. So when he was about to transition, we ordered our rogue to move across into position so he could get over there quickly, and then everyone else just stays kind of near the boss to finish him off. And then lastly, our paladin tank, who's on the far platform, the green one to my right, he'll move last, but since he's not an overcharge target, he just has to get over there before overcharge hits from the rogue that's on his platform. And here I'm just doing the normal stuff. So I use my castable monk sprint ability for this fight for both myself and any player in my quadrant that happens to get Helm of Command. Just another movement cooldown that's very handy. Yeah. So here we're into the second phase, and I don't think we had any ads going into it, so that's really good. And as I mentioned in the section, you'll always get full ball lightning spawns because of diffusion chain happening at the same time. So use any minor cooldowns for the raid. We use Aura Mastery on that. And then use stuns, of course. As a monk, I used to use a leg sweep for the ads because it's a long duration stun, but the ad timing is such that they're pretty much spawning and charging just as the cooldown is about to come up. It's a couple seconds off sometimes, so it wasn't always available when I wanted it, essentially. So I switched to the lower duration, but much lower cooldown stun that seemed to work a lot better, just more reliably. That way, at least for me, I could stun every time. But again, if you have a Death Knight or something that can death grip everything into position, your range can just be spread out around the boss just within death grip range, and then death grip them all as soon as they spawn, AE stun them, AE them down. It'll just be cake. That's going to be really helpful. So here we're moving to the second platform or quadrant, stacking in melee just like we did before for overcharge, and it works just great. There you can see I got the overcharge, so giant bear spinning around. And as soon as that hits, your 3 ball lightning spawners need to move out, so there they move out. And in our case, we had our holy paladin and our hunter who were assigned to stay in unless one of the ball spawners got static shock, and then they would swap. And lightning whip is obviously pretty easy to avoid. Your range players should do their best to stay close to the boss, just outside of melee range at all times, because the further away they are, the more difficult it will be to dodge lightning whip. And after that first whip went off, ranged are told to come back into range for the next overcharge, which just went off there. And now we have 3 range going out for the ball lightnings once again. There's the static shock. And here you can see we're tanking the boss kind of at the max range of his tether. The idea is that he'll gain a little less energy as he transitions than he did in the first one where we tanked him close to the pillar. And you'll actually see the energies, I think they're identical here. But that's just because sometimes he delays when he does Fusion Slash, and other times he doesn't. So keeping him close to the pillar of the first pillar and far away on the second pillar will help you with those potential issues. And we stopped DPS a moment ago, transitioning. So we stop at 35. dots and miscellaneous damage usually get him down to 33 or so, and then we can wait for the bouncing bolts and the ball lightnings, kill these off, and once they're about dead, then we call for DPS to focus on the boss. Once he's about 32%, our rogue is assigned to go across early so that he's in position for that overcharge. That's going to happen really quick. And then here you can see everyone positioning for the first overcharge and chain. And as I mentioned in the section, it's really useful if people kind of have a general position around the central circle of their platform. That way overcharge is always a predictable length into other platforms, and you're always in a good position for either Helm of Command or Diffusion Chain if you get that before overcharge. So there's another Diffusion Chain. We're safe to stack, melee stack up. Then we watch for balls. Here I notice there's 2 balls, so I tell melee I'm going to solo soak. And that's really a key to the entire intermission phase, is communicate with your platform teammates or your quadrant teammates. If you can solo soak, just say that you're solo soaking a static shock. If it's safe to stack up after diffusion chain, tell everyone that it's safe. If you're going to get the bouncing bolt on the right or the back or something, make sure you say that. All that stuff is really useful. So here we're into the final phase. Again, I don't think we had any ads, so really solid on both those. And as you might guess, this is where you blow all your DPS cooldowns, your bloodlusts, all that stuff should be available since you had intermission before. Here I'm part of the ranged group on this side, so I come out to soak, and there we got way too many ball lightnings. The other group that got thunderstruck tried to get in melee range, but they didn't quite get in range, so that's unfortunate. But again, make sure you have cooldowns available if you get extra ball lightnings, and try to stun them and all that. And generally speaking, DPS should focus on the ads first and foremost throughout the entire fight, and this third phase is no different. So there you see a diffused spawn in the back pops up, and our hunter throws down a trap to root it a little bit, get away. And as a healer, monk healer, I'm just trying to keep renewing mist on everybody, spamming my Thunder Focus T with 4-piece as much as possible. And really, your healer mana should be full going into this phase. Like, there's very little to do before this section. So just spam your heart out, especially if you're 2 healing it. There's going to be a lot of damage going on. And otherwise, just keep track of the timers. So we're getting tons of extra ball lightnings, which, again, is very unfortunate. We're not really doing that perfectly. But again, if you had a Warlock Portal, that would be much easier because of the Thunderstruck timing and whatnot. And I think we're coming up to the 3rd Static Shock. So our Paladin sort of freaks out and just sacks himself, which is certainly better than killing everyone if you happen to get Thunderstruck or something. But yeah, unfortunate. So we have a couple people down, but the boss is low enough here that we're able to finish it off. So that is the Heroic Lei Shen walkthrough. Once again, if you stuck around, thanks for watching, and good luck.